Welcome to r/MaliciousCompliance, where we share stories of people conforming to the letter but not the spirit of a request. And today we have 3 great stories, so subscribe, hit the like button, and let's begin. The first story: Boss told me I don't care, tell them whatever you want, so I did. The second story: laid off after illness, company tried to hire me back, I refused, they went out of business. The third story: forcing people to use a form that's impractical for their needs increases red tape to the point where it gets really expensive. The first story is: PM doesn't want to see the client. PM has to see the client anyway. Long ago I had this project manager, Richard, for obvious reasons, who was quite a character. The project we were working on was, to be very honest, an SH show. Tiny mom and pop company hired to take on a massive project with a big multinational engineering and construction firm. We had a huge team of three engineers and a rotating cast of PMs, who typically didn't last more than a few months before either their contracts were renewed, Big Boss decided they were too expensive, or simply weren't up to the task. Anyway, we were expected to produce copious amounts of paperwork, from project schedules, engineering manuals, engineering data sheets, drawings, schematics, etc. et al. The team was awesome. We got along well, we worked hard. However, there really was only so much we could do, and we were inexperienced dealing with huge projects, or the standards that multinational megacorps typically enforce with their paperwork. So that led to a lot of documents being returned with lots of comments, lots of recycle time, lots of frustration on both the clients and our side, and a lot of nasty language. Still, my colleagues and I learned a lot during this time, all 3 of us fresh from university. And to give due credit to the client, once we'd gotten to know some of their team and shared our situation with them, a few of their engineers were kind enough to spend many hours literally tutoring us on various things. I spent a whole week 9 to 5 every day, with one guy in particular who taught me how to draw P and ID diagrams professionally. One particular day, we got a call from the client asking the team to go attend a mediation/expediting session. Basically, go listen to the client cuss you out. We had this pretty often, like once or twice a month. So Richard decided he simply didn't want to go to this particular meeting. He said, "I'm not going. If you want to go on your own." I called the client to decline the meeting, only to get cussed out and told in no uncertain terms to attend the meeting. Mentioned me and Richard by name, or else there would be hell to pay. Big Boss sighs and says, "Just go." I consult Richard again, asking him what to tell the client. He said, I quote, "I don't care. Tell them whatever you want." Then kicks his feet up on his table, pulls out a newspaper and starts reading it. Dumbfounded, I left his room and went back to my desk seething. Next morning, I turn up at the client's office alone, get ushered into a big meeting room and sat down in front of 8 people, 4 of whom I knew as the regulars we dealt with, and the rest were introduced to me as senior GMs and a manager from the end-user company. Boy oh boy, me, a lowly lowest of the low peon, versus 4 mid-level bosses and 4 in-game bosses at the same time. Granted, they were professional when giving me a good earful about our company's abysmal performance, and then they asked the golden question: why are you here alone? Where is your PM to address these concerns? QMC: my PM declined to attend the meeting. Why? Richard said he doesn't care, and for me to tell you anything I like. The meeting ended shortly after that. But wait, there's more. The 4 regulars then dragged me into another meeting room, giving me a god-awful verbal lashing, and cussed me out for another hour. Then one out of the 4, an expediter named Joe, who had stayed silent throughout the second meeting, dragged me off to another meeting room, where I got cussed out again for another half hour over why do you let client's project team, the other 3 guys, verbally abuse you during almost every meeting like this. You should walk out or decline to attend when it gets abusive. Saying this whilst cussing me out. Crawling back to my own office, I retold the events to my big boss. Richard had taken the rest of the day off. He just sighed and told me to go back to work. That same afternoon, a nastygram came in, requesting for another meeting the next morning, this time with a demand for my PM's mandatory attendance. I forwarded it to my big boss, who then called Richard and voluntold him to attend. Richard then called me and angrily insisted I attend with him, then hung up before I could answer. Okay, fine then. Cue second dose of MC. The next morning I called in sick, texted Richard and stayed home. Shortly after the meeting started, Joe calls me to ask why I wasn't present, to which I replied, "You told me yesterday to walk out or decline if things get abusive. I thought today's meeting likely wouldn't be very amiable, so per your advice I've declined to attend." Joe simply laughed and said, "Fair enough." Richard got cussed out by the client for well over 2 hours that morning. 2 glorious hours during which I lay in bed. 2 weeks later, Richard got replaced by a new PM, who was much better and lasted till the end of the project. Edit/FAQ for those who may be wondering. Our little company was actually subcontracted by a larger company that won the bid for the project. The larger company actually didn't have the expertise, but my company did, so something was worked out. I heard that Big Boss actually didn't want the project, but he owed someone some massive favors, so he couldn't say no. He retired less than a year after the project was completed anyway. Don't know why we didn't get more engineers to work on the project, likely due to cost concerns. Larger company eventually did send us more manpower to help out, but they were a rotating cast of various specialists, e.g. draftsman, welding inspector, process consultant, etc., on very short-term contracts to complete singular tasks. The next story is Employee Revenge Story. Worked myself into very poor health for a small PCB design and manufacturing shop in the early 2000s. It was a very small company, recently acquired by a startup to combine some very complementary IP. I worked very hard with customers to meet all their supplier needs. About 80% plus of our output went to one very large industry leader, big customer. This included weekly and monthly calls and reports on manufacturing and field performance and failure rates, engineering change requests, corrective actions, etc. Very boring, very technical, but critically important. Big customer had retained my employer as a small supplier without a formal supplier contract. After a couple years, their policies changed, and they required my employer sign a supplier contract. At that time, we just enjoyed getting a new general manager, GM, forced on us by the parent startup, and he was a grievous a-hole. There was a whole section of the proposed supplier contract dealing with reporting requirements. The GM called me into his office and assigned me the task of writing up why each of their reporting requirements could not be met. I told him, after reading the entire contract, we are already in full compliance with every single reporting requirement documented. He about fell out of his chair and asked how that could be possible. It was possible because Big Customer's supplier manager had provided all their data and reporting needs to me about a year prior, and I established everything needed to support them and keep them happy. I told my GM he's copied on every single report I email out, weekly and monthly, with all the attachments that cover every single thing. In short, nothing extra needed. It's all been good for at least a year, and GM doesn't look at emails from me. I sorta knew that already. We all, knew the GM was there to change the business model, from a supplier to a design shop. It was a poorly kept secret. That is, we were going to stop designing, manufacturing and selling completed specialized product. Just design the boards and license the customers to go find their own contract manufacturers. I knew this strategy meant I would eventually be laid off, I just didn't expect it so fast. So, I'm so stressed out doing so many things I get a bad internal infection, and ended up in the hospital for a week, Sunday through Friday. I'd never had it before, didn't know what it was or how serious it was until I passed out at home. Got better, went back to work the next Monday. Got laid off about 10 a.m. that first day back. This was 2009, right at the start of the Great Recession. I was screwed, but didn't show it as I was getting laid off. I just smiled, refused to sign anything until I had 24 hours to review the terms, stood up, shook hands, walked out. Thankfully, I found employment again about a month after. That was amazing given my career choices and specialties at the time. One day shortly after starting my new work, I received a call from my old boss. He was asking questions about those reports. I actually felt sorry for him. He'd cry at my layoff, something even I hadn't done. Side note, I so wanted to tell him there's no crying in baseball, but I was in too foul a mood to be humorous at my layoff. I answered his questions fully, but I did not offer anything additional, knowing that he was hopelessly lost. Perhaps it's good to mention here, he was from a completely separate profession than I. He had no clue what I did, just that I kept Big Customer happy. Sure enough, a week following, my old boss calls me back and says the company wants to rescind my layoff and hire me back. I say, thanks, no thanks. 3 days after that, the GM who laid me off calls me and offers me my job back. I tell him, thanks, no thanks. He reminds me that I forfeit unemployment benefits if he files paperwork to the state, telling them they offered me my job back and I refused. I tell him, thanks, no thanks. I refused to be threatened or intimidated by him, especially because I had a new job that was covering my A, albeit at lower pay. Through it all, I stayed professional and polite. I also did not let on that I didn't need unemployment benefits at that time. I can't remember how many days later my former boss calls me back, says he's authorized to offer me my job back, bridging my service immediately, reallocating all my unvested stock options at their original vesting schedule, and reestablishing my paid time off hours that were cashed out when I was laid off. It was tempting because my new job was about a 25% pay cut. But I said thanks, no thanks. My boss asked me to sign a statement of refusal. I said thanks, no thanks, and hung up. A week later, I heard from a colleague the GM was gone. No explanation, just gone. About a month after that, the company was sold by the larger startup to a similar but quite large and well-established company, which was a supplier to big company. The good news was all the employees that weren't senior management were retained, including all my colleagues and my boss. The best revenge is a life well lived. The last story is formulaic de-increase in efficiency. I'm working as a pen tester for a large financial company. In this job, we need to get elevated permissions on some systems to do our tests. This has to be issued for the time these tests run, and of course tracked and everything. This was something that was usually done by us sending a list of the servers and the permissions we need to the network guys, who then did their magic to give us permissions. That system worked pretty well. We had our server lists ready, and basically just sent the relevant lists with a quick note, when and how long we needed to the networkers, who were used to us sending this, and developed a good routine. Mostly they just switched rules back on that already existed, just checking the lists we sent them for changes. Took us about 10 minutes to check whether the lists are still up to speed, and correct them, and the networkers had about 15 minutes of work to set everything the way it needed to be. 30 minutes of work, including coffee break, everyone was happy. It worked perfectly. Now to streamline and increase productivity, that alone should tell you that BS is afoot. The system got automated recently. In a form, you can now shop the permissions you need. You just put down the server, the ports, duration, reason, your laughs, your cries, your hopes, your dreams, your shoe size, and that of your superior into a form, and then you get everything automatically. Read the network gets it and then has to do it manually because, well, guess at what part security management asked them if they're nuts to just let anyone decide what rights they want. So far, so good. We were, well, let's say not too excited about it. Mostly about the form's rather awkward style. After a lengthy discussion with the person responsible for it, who doesn't exactly like us pen testers because we think that everything has to go the way we want, and we only want to play by our rules and can't just do our job, his words paraphrased, we were told in no uncertain terms that simply sending the network guys a list is not going to do it, and we will use the form. It only takes a minute, D. How spoiled can we be? Can we charge that minute it takes us on your department? Yes? Well, okay then, we don't really have a problem anymore. It only takes a minute. Pretty exactly a minute actually, give or take, depending on how responsive the server is that hosts the form, and how quickly you can type in your stuff. But, and that's the problem, you can only put in demands for yourself, not others, and for one server at a time. This is for most users not that big of a deal, since they generally only need to work with one server at a time. During a test, especially when targeting a semi-large server farm as we're about to, this can be a few more machines, and as you may imagine, a few more people. Or in this particular case now, precisely 782 systems and 12 people. 782 times 12 minutes, now that we're streamlined and productive, compared to 30 minutes back in our old sluggish and inefficient days. So we're using the form. After all, we have an account that we can charge with the time we spend on the form. A recent poll among my coworkers said that we clocked about 80 hours on it so far. But I have already almost 400 machines down, and so do most of the others, so we should not stress his budget with more than 5 figures when we're done. With the machines for this test at least. Not the test itself, mind you. 5 figures for red tape. Plus, and this is just for the network and firewall people reading here, can you imagine the difference in workload and stress on the firewalls when they need one rule per server, instead of being able to do subnet-based rules where multiple servers get handled by one rule? I have a hunch that we'll be back to our old ways no later than when he gets the numbers for this month from accounting, or when the firewallers start screaming because their walls melt under the workload. Let's see what happens first. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe.